For 11 months, my granddaughter and I shared a single room at the Riverside shelter on the east side of Tulsa, while my son-in-law sat in a house I paid for, driving the truck I co-signed and telling anyone who would listen that I had lost my mind. He wasn't entirely wrong about one thing. I had lost something, but it wasn't my mind. It was my faith in the idea that family meant something. My name is Edmund Grayson. I am 68 years old. I spent 40 years as a civil engineer, building overpasses and drainage systems across 3 states. I know how structures fail. I know that collapse doesn't happen all at once. It starts with a hairline crack you convince yourself isn't serious, then another. Then one morning you wake up and the whole thing is rubble, and everyone acts surprised. I should have seen the cracks in Darren Fowler the day my daughter brought him home. But let me back up. Because the part that matters, the part that changed everything, started on a Tuesday in February. Mia was 7 years old. She has a condition called selective mutism, which means she speaks, but only to people she trusts completely, and only when she feels absolutely safe. To strangers, to loud rooms, to anywhere that feels uncertain, she goes silent. Her teachers called it a behavior problem. Her pediatrician called it anxiety. I called it survival instinct, because Mia had learned early that the world was not always a place that deserved her voice. That Tuesday we had just come back from the shelter's common room, where another family's toddler had knocked over a folding table and sent metal chairs clattering across the linoleum floor. The noise sent Mia straight under her cot, hands over her ears, knees pulled to her chest. I sat on the floor beside her. I did not try to coax her out. I just sat there with my back against the metal frame, letting her know I was there, that the noise was over, that she was okay. We had been in that shelter for 11 months. I had $43 in my wallet. Outside, February was doing what February does in Oklahoma, which is, make you feel like the wind has a personal grudge against you. I had a 2008 Ford Escape with a cracked heater core and a slow leak in the rear left tire. I checked the tire pressure every morning before I drove Mia to school, because that was the one thing I could still control. I want to tell you how we got there, because it matters. My daughter Lee married Darren Fowler 6 years ago. I walked her down the aisle myself. Her mother had passed 2 years before that, ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end, and Lee had been adrift since then in the way that people who lose their anchor sometimes drift toward the nearest solid-looking thing. Darren was solid-looking. He was confident. He had a good handshake and he remembered people's names. At the reception, he toasted to family. He said he wanted to take care of Lee the way her father always had. I believed him. That was my first crack. The second crack came 18 months later when Lee was in her final trimester with Mia and Darren started talking about the house. My house, specifically. The house I had owned free and clear since 2001. A 4-bedroom Craftsman in the Maple Ridge neighborhood that I had bought with 30 years of careful savings and the insurance settlement from a side accident that had taken 2 fingers off my left hand. I keep the middle and the ring finger. I lost the index and the pinky. I mention this because Darren used to joke about it at family dinners. He called it my discount handshake. Lee would tell him to stop and he would laugh and say he was only kidding. He suggested I move in with them. Lee was nervous about the pregnancy. She wanted family close. I agreed. I was 62, recently retired, and I wanted to be near my daughter and the grandchild coming. So I transferred the property to a family trust that Darren suggested a lawyer friend of his had set up. It was supposed to protect the asset from estate taxes. It was supposed to be seamless. I signed the paperwork at a kitchen table while Lee made tea, and Darren explained everything in a calm, reasonable voice that I now understand was the voice of a man who had rehearsed. Mia was born that April. She was perfect. I held her in the hospital room for 2 hours while Darren took a call in the hallway. Things shifted slowly after that. Darren started working from home. Then he started having people over. Business contacts, he called them. Men I didn't recognize who came on Thursday evenings and left late and sometimes left envelopes on the kitchen counter. The house began to feel like his house. The guest room I occupied began to feel like a favor. He started referring to the property in conversations as our place, and I noticed that the mail began arriving in his name only. When I raised it with Lee, she told me I was reading too much into things. She was tired. She was nursing Mia and managing a part-time job and managing Darren and managing me, and she didn't have the capacity for conflict. I understood, so I stayed quiet. That was my third crack. The eviction came on a Thursday. Not a legal eviction. Darren didn't file paperwork. He came in my room at 7 in the morning while I was drinking coffee and reading the paper, and he told me in a flat, pleasant voice that things weren't working out. He said I was creating tension. He said Lee agreed. He said the room would need to be cleared out by the end of the month. I looked at him. I said, "This is my house, Darren." He smiled. It was the smile of a man who already knew something you didn't. He said. Check the trust documents. I spent $2,000 I couldn't afford on a lawyer who confirmed what I was afraid of. The trust had been restructured 6 months earlier. Darren had been added as co-trustee, and then, during a period when I had a minor stroke and was in inpatient rehab for 3 weeks, he had removed me. The stroke was small. I recovered fully, but the paperwork had been filed while my signature was easily forged, and my lawyer said proving that would be expensive, slow, and uncertain. I left with Mia because Lee didn't fight him on the custody arrangement, and the court, seeing a stable home with 2 parents versus a grandfather with a freshly documented stroke, sided with what looked like stability. Darren got temporary custody with Lee's agreement. Then Leigh stopped returning my calls. Mia was brought to me by her preschool teacher of all people, a woman named Miss Holloway, who called me one afternoon and said the little girl had not spoken in 3 days and had scratched her own arms trying to get out of a car seat. The teacher drove her to the shelter herself. She cried in the parking lot. I told her she had done the right thing. I don't know if she believed me. That was how Mia and I ended up on a cot at Riverside, checking tire pressure every morning, sharing a room with 4 other people and a drafty window that leaked cold air no matter how much cardboard we stuffed in the frame. 11 months, $43. That Tuesday night, after the folding table incident, after Mia finally fell asleep with her hand curled around my thumb, I sat on the edge of the cot and looked at the ceiling and tried to calculate whether I had made a mistake that could still be undone or a mistake that was permanent. A soft knock at the door of our room. I almost didn't answer. Late-night knocks at shelters are usually staff doing wellness checks or someone who got the wrong door, but something about the rhythm of it was different. 3 quiet knocks, deliberate, like someone who didn't want to wake Mia. I eased my hand out from under hers and crossed the room. The woman standing in the hallway was about 40. She was wearing a gray wool coat over a dark blazer, and she was holding a manila folder and a paper cup of coffee that was clearly from somewhere that wasn't this building. She looked at me with the steady, measuring expression of someone who has thought carefully about what they are about to say. "Mr. Grayson," she said, "my name is Helen Marsh. I'm a family law attorney. I've been trying to find you for 6 weeks. I looked at the folder. I looked at the coffee. I said, if you're here for Darren Fowler, you picked the wrong side of that conversation. I'm not, she said. Can we talk somewhere quiet? I don't want to disturb your granddaughter. We sat at a table in the shelter's empty dining hall. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. She set the coffee in front of me and opened the folder before she said anything else. I work with a nonprofit called the Family Integrity Project, she said. We take cases involving vulnerable minors and elder financial exploitation. A social worker flagged your case 4 months ago, but your address was in the wind. We found you through Mia's school enrollment. I looked at the folder. There were documents I recognized, the trust paperwork, the modification filing, dates I hadn't seen before. The restructuring of that trust, Helen said, tapping a specific page, was filed on March 9th. You were admitted to St. Francis for your stroke on March 6th. You were discharged March 27th. She looked at me. You were physically incapable of signing anything on March 9th, Mr. Grayson. My hand was on the table. I looked at the page. Then I looked at the ceiling. I know that, I said. My lawyer said proving it would take years. Your lawyer didn't have this. She slid a document across the table. It was a visitor log from the law office where the modification was filed. The attorney who filed this has had his license suspended twice for document irregularities. He's currently under investigation by the Oklahoma bar. He kept visitor logs, probably to protect himself. Darren Fowler signed in on March 8th. She paused. Darren doesn't notarize his own documents, Mr. Grayson. He hired someone, and that someone kept records. I sat with that for a moment. The fluorescent light buzzed. Outside, a car passed on the street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the high windows. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Two things," Helen said. "First, an affidavit from you about the stroke timeline. Second, an emergency custody petition for Mia, because what I haven't told you yet is why I came tonight instead of waiting for business hours." She pulled out one more sheet. It was a document from the Department of Human Services, a welfare check report on Mia filed 9 days ago. "Darren petitioned the court last week to formalize his custody arrangement," Helen said, "and to terminate your visitation rights on the grounds that shelter living constitutes an unsafe environment for a child. The hearing is Friday." Friday was 3 days away. "He is trying to permanently cut me off from you," Helen said, "and with the current paperwork in his favor, his chances are not bad." I looked at the DHS report. I looked at my left hand with its missing fingers. I thought about Mia under the cot with her hands over her ears. "Then let's make sure his chances get worse," I said. We worked until 2 in the morning at that table. Helen had copies of everything. She was meticulous in the way that people who grew up being dismissed tend to be meticulous, thorough past the point of necessity. She told me later that she had been in foster care as a child, which is why family exploitation cases made her work different hours than anyone else at the organization. I signed the affidavit. I gave her the name of every person who had been present at the original trust signing. I gave her the name of Darren's Thursday evening visitors, 2 of whom I had quietly photographed from the upstairs window after the 4th or 5th visit. An instinct I couldn't explain at the time, but was grateful for now. One of those photographs turned out to matter quite a lot. The man in it was named Clifton Drake. I had no idea who he was when I photographed him. Helen knew immediately. Clifton Drake was a licensed real estate broker who had been named in a 2019 civil suit involving fraudulent property transfers. He had settled out of court, he had continued brokering, and he had, according to records Helen already had in her folder, handled the sale of 3 properties in the past 2 years that had been transferred out of family trusts under disputed circumstances. Darren wasn't just removing me from my own house, he had a system. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark next to Mia's cot and listened to her breathe. I thought about Lee. I thought about the woman she had been before Darren, cautious but warm, the kind of person who left voicemails that were too long because she always thought of one more thing to say. I wondered if she knew all of it or just some of it, or if she had convinced herself that knowing less was the same as being innocent. Thursday morning, I dropped Mia at school and drove to Helen's office. She had made calls overnight. She had filed the emergency custody petition. She had also done something I hadn't asked her to do, which was contact a forensic document examiner at the University of Tulsa, who agreed to do a rush analysis of the trust modification signature on a volunteer basis. The examiner's name was Dr. Abigail Sato. She was 70 years old. She had testified in over 200 cases, and she had a reputation, Helen told me, for being the person you called when you needed to be certain. Dr. Sato came back to us by noon. The signature on the March 9th document was not mine. The pressure pattern, the letter spacing, the pen angle, none of it matched the verified samples from my other documents. Her written report used the word definitive 3 times. I sat in Helen's office and read the report. My hands were not shaking. That surprised me. I thought they would be shaking, but they were still. They were the hands of a man who had spent 40 years reading structural analysis reports and had learned that the difference between a building that stands and a building that falls is whether someone is willing to look at the evidence honestly. "This is the foundation," I told Helen. "Now we build." The Friday hearing was in Family Court Division B. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wood paneling that needed refinishing. A judge named the Honorable Patricia Weston, who had gray hair cut short and reading glasses that she wore, pushed down her nose and that she looked over the top of when she was about to say something important. Darren was there with a lawyer whose suit cost more than I made in my last month of working. He did not look at me when I came in. He arranged himself at the plaintiff's table with the posture of a man who had sat in courtrooms before and found them friendly. Beside me, Helen set her files on the table with the quiet confidence of someone who was not concerned about what was about to happen. The first 20 minutes were difficult. Darren's lawyer was skilled. He painted a picture I recognized. The same picture Darren had been painting for anyone who would look. A loving step-parent. A stable home. A grandfather whose stroke had raised legitimate questions about his capacity to supervise a young child with special needs. A grandfather who had voluntarily transferred property and then claimed coercion. It was a coherent story. It was delivered with sympathy. The lawyer even expressed at one point genuine-sounding concern for my well-being. Mia was in a waiting room down the hall with a court-appointed child advocate named Mrs. Berard, a woman with a braided silver ponytail who had, I was told, been doing this work since before Darren was born. I sat still. I kept my hands flat on the table. And then it was Helen's turn. She started with the medical records. St. Francis Hospital. Admission date, March 6th. Discharge date, March 27th. The judge looked at the dates and looked at the trust modification filing date without Helen having to say anything. She said it anyway. Mr. Fowler's co-trustee, Edmund Grayson, was medically incapacitated and physically present at an inpatient rehabilitation facility on the date this modification was filed, Helen said. He could not have signed this document. He did not sign this document. She submitted Dr. Sato's report as Exhibit A. Darren's lawyer objected. The judge overruled him with the speed of someone who had already read the exhibit summary in her pre-hearing review. Then Helen submitted the visitor log from the filing attorney's office. Darren's name, March 8th. The judge read it in silence. The only sound in the room was the court reporter typing. Then Helen did something I had not expected. She asked the judge's permission to play a voicemail. It was from Lee. I had not heard my daughter's voice in 4 months. It hit me in the chest in a way I had not prepared for. Her voice was different than I remembered. Quieter, careful in the way of someone who has learned to say things as if they might be repeated. The voicemail had been left on Helen's office line 2 days earlier. Lee said she had found documents in Darren's home office. She said she did not understand all of them, but that some of them were receipts from Clifton Drake for commissions on property transfers. She said she knew that name because Darren had told her Drake was just a buddy from college. She said she was scared. She said she was sorry. She said she wanted Mia to be with her grandfather. The courtroom was quiet. Darren's lawyer was writing something on a notepad very fast. Darren himself was doing something I had not seen him do in 6 years of knowing him. He was sitting completely still. He was not composing himself. He was not arranging his expression. He was simply still, the way a structure goes still the moment before it fails. The judge looked at him over her glasses. "Mr. Fowler," she said, "do you wish to address the evidentiary record before I rule on the emergency petition?" Darren looked at his lawyer. His lawyer said something quietly. Darren looked at the table. "No, Your Honor," he said. The judge ruled within 10 minutes. Emergency custody to me, effective immediately. The trust modification was referred to the district attorney's office for review of potential forgery. The judge further noted that the court would be requesting a separate hearing on the original property transfer and that the filing attorney's name had been flagged to the Oklahoma Bar's Oversight Committee. She looked at Darren one final time. "Mr. Fowler," she said, "if I were advising you personally, I would suggest you speak to a criminal defense attorney before the end of business today." He walked out of the courtroom without his lawyer, who was still packing his briefcase. I sat at the table and breathed. Helen put her hand briefly on my arm. "She's down the hall," she said. "Go get her." Mia was sitting on a bench in the waiting room, coloring with the careful concentration of a child who colors the way other people meditate. Mrs. Berard was beside her, not talking, just present. When I walked through the door, Mia looked up. She looked at my face. She looked at it for a long time, reading it the way she reads everything, slow and thorough. Then she got off the bench and walked to me and put her arms around my waist and pressed her face against my side. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I held her there in that waiting room for a long time, long enough that Mrs. Berard quietly let herself out and gave us the room. The weeks that followed were not simple. They rarely are. Lee left Darren the same week the DA opened an investigation. She moved into a studio apartment in Broken Arrow and called me on a Tuesday evening 11 days after the hearing. The call lasted 2 hours. She said she had known something was wrong for 2 years. She said she had told herself it was her imagination, then told herself it wasn't her business, then told herself she couldn't afford to know. I told her I understood. I do understand. It is easy to look at someone from the outside and see clearly what they could not see from the inside. She cried. I did not tell her it was okay, because it wasn't entirely. But I told her the path forward was still there. Darren was indicted 4 months later on charges of forgery, fraudulent transfer, and elder financial exploitation. Clifton Drake was indicted alongside him. The man who had notarized the forged signature took a plea deal and testified for the prosecution in exchange for reduced charges. The filing attorney surrendered his license before the bar completed its investigation. The house took longer. Property litigation takes time in Oklahoma, as it takes time everywhere, and for several months I was not certain how it would resolve. But Dr. Sato's report, the visitor log, Lee's testimony, and 3 witnesses who had been present at the original signing all pointed the same direction. The court voided the trust modification. The property reverted to the original trust with me as sole trustee. I did not move back in immediately. The house had been rented out by Darren to a young family with 2 kids who had done nothing wrong and needed time to find another place. I gave them 6 months and helped them find a rental in the same school district. When I finally walked back through that front door, it smelled different than I remembered. It smelled like someone else's life, which it had been. I opened all the windows even though it was cold. I let the February air move through the rooms until they smelled like nothing, like a beginning. Mia stood in the center of the living room and turned around slowly, looking at everything. "This was Mom's house when she was little?" she asked. Her voice was small, precise, the way she speaks when she is deciding whether a space is safe. "And mine before that," I said, "and it's ours now." She walked to the window and looked out at the front yard. "Can we put a bird feeder there?" she asked. "We can put whatever you want there," I said. She nodded, seriously, as if this was a significant decision she had just made. Then she went to find her backpack. I stood in that living room for a moment by myself. I looked at the fireplace I had built by hand in 2003. I looked at the hardwood floors I had refinished twice. I looked at the walls I had painted, repainted, and painted again over 30 years of living in this place. I thought about the men I had worked with who used to say that you could tell a structure's integrity by standing inside it and listening. A good building has a quality to it that a failing one doesn't. It's not a sound exactly. It's more of an absence of sound, a settling, a rightness. The house was quiet. I want to tell you something about the months we spent at Riverside, because I have been asked, and because I think it's the part people miss when they only hear the ending. I don't regret the shelter. I know that sounds wrong. 11 months is a long time. The food was institutional and the noise was constant, and there was a period in the late fall when Mia had a cough that I was terrified would become pneumonia, and I sat awake beside her cot for 3 nights counting her breaths. I don't minimize any of that. But in that shelter I had no pretenses left. There was no house to protect, no social position to maintain, no version of myself that needed managing. There was only Mia's hand in mine, the tire pressure check every morning, and the clarity that comes when everything unnecessary has been stripped away. I learned something about myself that I hadn't known at 67. I had spent my career building structures that would outlast me. I had been proud of that, the permanence of concrete and steel. But the most durable thing I ever built had nothing to do with engineering. It was the trust of a 7-year-old girl who had decided the world was unsafe and made an exception for me. Don't let anyone make you feel that staying is the same as strength. I stayed quiet for too long because I called it patience. I tolerated things I shouldn't have because I told myself that keeping the peace was the same as keeping the family together. It isn't. Silence in the face of wrongdoing is not dignity. It is the thing wrongdoing feeds on. If something feels wrong, write it down. Keep the dates. Keep the copies. Not because you're planning for a fight, but because the people who mean to harm you are already planning for one, and they're counting on you being unprepared. I'm not a man who prays in formal ways, but I believe that certain things happen in a certain order for a reason, that the right person appears in a shelter hallway on a February Tuesday because the timing of a crisis is not random. I believe that what looks like the end of something is sometimes the frame of a door you haven't walked through yet. Mia has been talking more. Not all the time, not to everyone, but at dinner last week, she told me a story about something that happened at school. A friend who had gotten her shoe stuck in the mud on the playground and cried, and how Mia had taken off her own shoe and stood in the mud beside her so the friend wouldn't be alone in it. She told it in 3 full sentences, unprompted, looking at me across the table. I am 68 years old. I have built overpasses. I have built drainage systems. I have poured foundations in 3 states. I have never built anything as strong as whatever is growing in that little girl. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not the courtroom, not the judge's gavel. It's the night in the sheltered dining hall when Helen slid that trust document across the table. And I saw for the first time that the signature on it wasn't mine. I didn't feel triumph in that moment. I felt something quieter and colder. The recognition that I had trusted a man I should have questioned, and that my silence had cost Mia and me 11 months of a life we didn't need to lose. I've thought a lot about what I did wrong. Not to punish myself, but because I think honesty about your own failures is the only way to keep them from repeating. I stayed quiet when I should have asked harder questions. I signed documents I should have had independently reviewed. I confused keeping the peace with keeping the family intact, and those 2 things are not the same. The peace I was keeping was built on a foundation that Darren had already started hollowing out. I just didn't want to see it. What saved us in the end wasn't luck. It was a combination of things I had done quietly and without knowing why. I kept the photographs of Darren's Thursday visitors because something felt off, and I had learned in 40 years of engineering to document what doesn't sit right. I kept copies of the original trust documents in a fireproof box in my car because my wife, before she passed, always said you keep the paperwork. Those 2 habits, the photographs, the copies, turned out to be the frame that held everything together when Helen started building the case. That's the part I want people to hear. You don't have to know you're preparing for a fight. You just have to pay attention and write things down. Integrity isn't only about what you do when things are good. It's about the habits you keep when nothing feels urgent. I kept those documents because it was the right thing to do, not because I anticipated needing them. That's the difference between acting from character and acting from strategy. And then there's Mia. A 7-year-old girl who had decided the world was not safe enough to speak to freely, and who stood in that waiting room and walked straight to me without saying a word. She didn't need me to be powerful. She needed me to still be there, staying, not quitting, not disappearing into shame, not giving Darren the satisfaction of watching me collapse. That was the hardest thing I did in those 11 months. Some mornings I checked the tire pressure on that Ford Escape and genuinely wasn't sure I had anything left. But I did it anyway. That kind of persistence isn't dramatic. It doesn't look like strength from the outside. It looks like a 68-year-old man kneeling in a parking lot with a gauge in his hand in the cold. But it adds up. What I know now is this. The people who try to take what belongs to you are counting on 3 things. They're counting on you being too trusting to question them. They're counting on you being too proud to ask for help. And they're counting on you being too exhausted to fight back. Darren had all 3 working in his favor for a long time. What he didn't count on was that a man who has spent his life building things that are meant to last understands, at a cellular level, that you don't walk away from a structure just because someone told you it wasn't yours anymore. The house on Maple Ridge is still standing, so are we.